Hi, I'm Kim Peets and welcome to My Story, His Story. What do we know about Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and how has God influenced them? In this series, we take a closer look at the lives of these Christian leaders and invite them to share some of their stories with us. Here with me is Pastor Chester Stanley, Senior Church Leader. Hi Chester.
Great to be with you today, Kim.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here.
Yes.
Now, you've had a very interesting childhood, and I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, I was born into a preacher's family. I was the firstborn. My father was an Adventist pastor, and probably more specifically, an Adventist evangelist. And back in those days, conference administrations wanted to get the very most out of those people that had the gift of evangelism. And so consequently, we shifted very, very often. In fact, I was in my early ministry where I actually lived in one town for 3 years. And that was the first time I'd ever lived in one place for 3 years.
Would have seemed like an awfully long time.
It was a terribly long time. Same house, same street. It was interesting.
You would have been looking for a change, I imagine.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. You get a bit restless. Yeah. But so that was sort of the lifestyle that we lived. A lot of that was interstate transfers. Right across Australia, so it was it was an interesting childhood in that respect. But it was there was probably a downside to it, but it was also very positive in many respects. Lots of great people in the churches across Australia, and I remember very clearly we'd go to Newtown, and I always used to love going out and staying on farms.
Okay.
And I'd suss out those people who were farmers in the congregation, and then they would invite me to stay in their farms, and I'd go out for the weekends and stay in the farms and help milk the cows and drive the cattle and all that sort of thing. And I just loved it. No, it was very good. And we did move a lot.
Oh, and how many schools did you go to?
Oh, look, Kim, I think I went to something like 14 different schools. A lot of that was interstate. And repeatedly I would go to a new school and they'd say, sorry, we don't have that subject here. So I think I've done everything from how to make square breadboards to knitting to English and maths, just the whole works.
Yes.
Just about all the subjects, I think.
And did you fit in? Like each school you would have had to make new friends, you would have had to fit in. And I think, you know, back in the days where it wasn't very trendy to be vegetarian, how did that go?
Yeah, well, in terms of fitting in, it would be fair to say that because my father was doing a lot of work in towns where we didn't have much of a presence, an Adventist presence, so consequently the vast majority of schools were in fact state schools, or later on some of them tended to be small church schools. That was sort of the background, and so it was a bit of a challenge sometimes. Every year, and I look back upon this with some anxiety in terms of just going to the new school. You know, everybody was new. 12 months later it had happened again. The teacher's putting stuff up on the board, you haven't got a clue what he's talking about, you've never seen it before. Yeah, it was tough going in that respect. I suppose also what didn't help in some respects was the fact that my father being an evangelist, you know, and he would advertise strongly in a town that there was this special program coming, and so there'd be lots of advertising around. And back in those days, in fact, often he used to run programs in tents.
Oh, okay.
You know, sort of like the circus tent has come to town, and of course that was quite an attraction. I mean, sometimes he did it intentionally because of just the attraction value in the tent.
Yes, I can imagine.
Of course, I have many memories of kids coming up to me and saying, oh, your father's the priest. And I remember chiding one young man, as I'm in primary school, and says, well, look, you should know better. No, my father isn't a priest. Priests don't have children. And so, you know, but then, oh, your dad's the one who lives in the tent, you know, and anyway, this sort of stuff. So it was challenging in that respect, but I suppose it helps one to develop some inner strength and it toughens you up in life. So
Definitely.
yeah.
Tell us a story about the mould sandwiches. I love this story.
Do you? Okay, right. Well, I'll share it again with you, kid. I do remember as an example of this sort of thing on one occasion at a school, a state school. I was in primary school, and we used to have to sit in a special part of the playground and eat our lunch. And the point of this was there's a teacher patrolling around and making sure that everybody ate their lunch. And my mum, and I must say this first, she was a good cook. But one thing that she used to make was macaroni mould. Now,
you might need to explain for the viewers what that is.
I will. Well, it's made of macaroni and I wouldn't have a clue what else, but I do remember that she used to put these herbs in it, and it was like eating, grass seeds, it was and mixed up in these mixed herbs in this macaroni. And as a family, we simply called it mould,
Okay.
And I never really liked it. Now I get to school, I've got macaroni, I've got mould in my sandwich, and I didn't want to eat it. Because of the herbs, and the teacher wasn't looking, so I dropped them in the bin. But there were no other sandwiches in the bin. He patrols around, he comes back and he says, somebody's put the sandwiches in the bin, and whose sandwiches are they? I fess up, yes, they're my sandwiches. So he comes to me and he says, well, why did you put your sandwiches in the bin? And I said, because I didn't like what my mother put in them. And he said, well, what did your mother put in them? And in all innocence, I simply said she put mould. And anyway, this teacher, he knew my father belonged to this. At that stage, the church wasn't widely known. He knew that my dad was preaching at a tent in the centre of town, and probably had heard some distorted stories about what it means to be an Adventist, and probably heard about the vegetarian thing, a distorted perspective of that as well. And he came up to me and he looked at me, and he was just you could see he was trying to work this whole thing out. And he said, well, Chester, look, if my mum had put mould in my sandwiches, I wouldn't have wanted to eat them either, so you could leave them in the bin. But very, very clearly, I mean, he probably thought it was some part of a very, fanatical health regime that one ate mould.
Yes.
But anyway, that's the experience that you wanted us to share.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing these stories. It must have been an amazing life, but yet you chose to also live this life.
Yes.
And I think that's fantastic.
Yes.
Coming up next, we have Chester is going to share a literally heart-stopping event. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I'm talking with Pastor Chester Stanley, Senior Church Leader. Chester, despite the fact that you've been vegetarian and you've shared some very interesting stories about that, you're very lucky to be alive right now, aren't you?
Absolutely. No question about that at all, Kim. Just recently, 2 years ago, I went through a very, very serious and dramatic event.
What happened?
Well, I suppose in very simple terms, I had a heart attack. That's what happened.
But you're young, you're a vegetarian, you've always eaten healthy.
And that's a very good question. Without going into too much of an analytical doctor's report on it, I think that, I think sometimes we have some genetic stuff. Who knows where it comes from? It would be fair to say that I didn't have any symptoms in terms of never had high blood pressure or high cholesterol. The only thing I had a challenge with from time to time was triglycerides, but the doctors didn't worry about it. And they examined my diet and said that we can't fault it. So life was going along well, and in my case, very simply, it was a small piece of plaque that simply cracked. That's all that happened.
Oh, that's amazing.
And then the blood flowing through the coronary artery, in simple terms, said, this is a wound, we need to fix it up. And so it was a blood clot that caused the problem.
And where were you when this happened?
Well, it was a Sabbath morning, and we're at our house here in Melbourne, and I felt this pain in my arm. I had been furiously establishing a garden, digging out very solid clay, morning and evening for a couple of weeks prior to this, and using a pick, and it was really, really tough work. So I discounted this pain and just assumed it was muscular. Anyway, it got fairly consistent, but it wasn't particularly painful, but it was unusual. I went down to my study, looked up one of the old Adventist medical books, and because I'd had no experience in this sort of thing, and sure enough, it talked about it being a symptom of a precursor to something pretty serious with your heart. So we rang up the local doctor, the secretary answered, my wife said to the girl, I think there's something serious happening with my husband's heart. She said, would you like to come in this afternoon? This was 9 o'clock in the morning, that was particularly helpful. Anyway, she insisted we speak to a doctor. The doctor said, ring 000 immediately, and we did that. Within just a few minutes, the ambulance fellas arrived. And they came in. I was sitting in a chair in the lounge room and chatting to them. They said, what would you give the pain out of 10? I said, probably 5 or 6, something like that. It's not particularly... and I was in the process of saying that, and Kim, that's the last thing I remember. I assume my heart went to extreme fibrillation at that point. They dragged me onto the floor and immediately tried to resuscitate me.
And how many times did your heart actually stop?
Well, between that event and getting me to the hospital, my heart actually stopped 12 times.
You are really lucky to be here today.
Yeah, we're very fortunate, very fortunate. If those ambulance men had not been there is no question my wife, Robin, would not have been able to restart my heart, given the nature of what was happening to it. There's just not a question about that at all. And so the timing in that respect was impeccable.
That's amazing. And really, if you hadn't gone to your medical book and worked it out, you wouldn't have had the officers there.
Yes, for sure.
That is truly an amazing story. You've done some amazing things in your life, and obviously there are many more amazing things yet to be done.
Yes. Well, you know, I must say out of that experience that there were some tough times there in hospital. One nurse said to me, the doctors are extremely worried about you. It's really good to go to bed to sleep at night time with that in your mind.
No.
And it was serious stuff for a couple of weeks there, and it could have gone the other way so easily. But, the support we received as a family was just wonderful. And I must say, my wife and my boy were there when this happened. It wasn't a problem with me. I didn't know a thing. They certainly knew lots. It was very painful for them.
It would have been very hard for your family.
But we received just the number of phone calls and letters and cards. It was just, occasionally people are critical of the church and say there's not a lot of love there. I think there's tons and tons of love. And that was demonstrated in a very special way.
That's amazing. That's just amazing. Well, thank you so much for that story. And as we come up next, we'll talk about Chester's favourite Bible character. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I'm talking with Pastor Chester Stanley, Senior Church Leader. Chester, I have really enjoyed our stories. You've talked about your varied childhood and moving from place to place, and we've just touched on some very personal matters before the break, just talking about your heart attack. It sounds like you've had a varied ministry throughout, and you've gone from local pastor to all senior levels of church administration. I'd love to hear a little bit more about where you've been.
Okay, I have worked as a young intern and a young pastor in the northern part of Australia, in the tropical part of Australia, in Queensland. As a young man, it was actually up there that I met my wife. Then from there, we're up there for a few years. I was the youth pastor in a major church just north of Sydney and had an interesting couple of years there. I was married there, and then from there went to a town called Coffs Harbour, actually, and we have a lovely church there, a miserable place to live. And we used to go surfing every morning at 6 o'clock and come home and have avocados and oranges for breakfast. It's a beautiful place, yes, and lovely people. 2 years there in Coffs Harbour. Then we're called to Papua New Guinea. I'd never sort of seen myself in that sort of light of being a missionary. And it was interesting, actually, at that stage I was reading a book called Tell It to the World by C. Mervyn Maxwell from Andrews University. A very inspiring book about the rise of the Adventist Church and the church and the mission of the church. And I'd read this book and thought it was a very good book, and I thought to myself, excuse me, I really can't say no to a call like that after believing that this was a very, very significant book and a very significant message. So we headed off to Papua New Guinea, and we're up there for 11 years in that country.
That's a long time.
The first half of that time, I was district director in the capital, Port Moresby, as well as university chaplain. We have a large group of young people who are going to university there. By far the most mature, the biggest group of Christians in the campus, actually.
Oh, wow.
And then I also worked out of lay in terms of caring for pastors across the country. But that was it's always interesting to live in another culture, you know.
It is, and it is very hard. And Papua New Guinea is quite a difficult place to live in, I believe.
Yes, we had lots of, I could keep you here for a long time, Kim, in terms of stories of security issues, etc., etc. But on the other side, apart from the richness of living in another culture, that, you know, the message of the gospel is just transforming lives by the tens of thousands.
Absolutely.
And the testimony of what the gospel can do in the context of that culture is just a powerful evidence of the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
That's so true. That's so true. Can you share with us just an interesting story about living in PNG and one of the particular things that happened?
Yeah, okay. Well, look, there's all kinds of things. For example, I remember on one occasion we were in a mission house in Port Moresby, and in the kitchen there was this big cupboard up on the wall. We had all our crockery that we'd been given from when we were married a few years earlier. Everything was up there. I'm out in the study, which was out in the veranda. My wife is somewhere. We heard this enormous roar and crash. Wondered what on earth had happened. We came inside. This whole thing had come off the wall, bounced on the shelf, and here it was lying in the middle of the kitchen. Everything was broken. All the stuff, just everything. On another occasion in that house, which had potential to be very, very sobering, we're on the side of a very steep hill, and either accidentally or rolling a rock, but a boulder about this size rolling down the hill and caught speed and eventually bounced over a back fence, which was about 6-7 feet high, landed once under a mango tree, and then bounced on the back veranda and broke boards that were about this thick, and then ploughed straight through the walls of the house. Again, I was out in the study. I had a little girl, a blonde little girl. She was about 2 or 3, on a tricycle in the lounge area, and my wife was on the phone there right next to her. The stone came through both walls of the house, and then it hit the dining room suite and smashed the legs, or a couple of legs, on the dining room suite.
Oh my goodness.
And in that process, it deflected the rock, and it missed my little girl by this sort of, you know, distance, and came to rest in the middle of the lounge room. But again, it was, you know, it was very, very dramatic stuff, and I suppose one is aware to a significant degree of, of the protection of the Lord in those sort of situations. You travel in mission planes, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. I mean, I think if we had more time, we could sit and we could probably hear story after story about God's leading in your life and all sorts of things. And that leads me to ask you, who is your favourite Bible story, and how has it helped you in those times of a lot of difficulty and near misses and near-death experiences?
For sure. Okay, I probably don't have one favourite Bible character. I might have had when I was a little boy, but there are lots of, inspirational people in Scripture. But in regard to this situation, and I've chosen Jeremiah. He's an Old Testament prophet, and I suppose to me the interesting thing is that we usually think of Jeremiah, in fact traditionally he's called the weeping prophet.
Yeah, okay.
Or the pessimist. I mean, Jeremiah is just full of woe, And essentially the reason for it was that because Israel, Nebuchadnezzar and the armies were coming towards Israel, and God was directing Jeremiah, the prophet, to counsel the people of Israel and say, surrender is what you need to do. Don't try and fight. You need to surrender. But of course, proud nation, they weren't interested in hearing that sort of story. Not at all. And so they didn't like Jeremiah. They banned him from preaching in the temple. And then they got so extreme, and you may remember the story, they actually dropped him down into a dungeon and a pit, and left him down there because they were so exasperated with Jeremiah. And, as a young man, he was told he wasn't allowed to get married, so that was a bit of a blow. God tags him on the shoulder and says, I've called you to ministry. He probably had other things he wanted to do. And so, it's a very interesting background, and yet I believe that even though he's perceived as being a pessimist and as the weeping prophet, that I believe that Jeremiah in one particular act showed that he was indeed, he was an optimist, and that he had a wonderful faith in God. He actually went and bought a field from a cousin in another town that had already been overrun by the Babylonians, the Nebuchadnezzar's army. And he got before all the people of Israel, he signs the deeds of release, he puts them in a jar. And essentially what he is saying is, and then he made a statement to the people. He said, I'm buying this, and the future is going to be better, and one day this will be my piece of land. And the people, of course, laughed at him, said, this is ridiculous. Why on earth would you buy real estate? It's never going to be yours. But he was declaring, God has told me that one day the land will be redeemed and we will be a strong people again. And so when you look at that, he was a man of tremendous optimism. And one day he was very discouraged. He's looking out his window and God said to him, Jeremiah, what can you see? And he says, I can see an almond tree, and the branch of an almond, and it's actually in blossom. And the Lord came to Jeremiah and said, I am watching over my word to perform it. And again, Jeremiah realised that beyond the challenges of life, that God reigns supreme, and that he is in control, and his word is sure. And we live in an age where there's tremendous amounts of negativism about and pessimism. But we, because we know the end of the story, as Christian believers, we know that the end of the story is bright with promise.
That's so true. Thank you so much for your time, Chester.
Pleasure.
I've really enjoyed hearing your stories, and I know that the viewers would have too.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much for watching My Story, His Story. I'm Kim Peets, and we hope that you join us next time.